Ministers Shanmugam and Vivian Balakrishnan cleared of wrongdoing in the rental of state properties at Ridout Road. Investigations found no preferential treatment was given to them. And for more, we have Dr. Gillian Koh. She's Deputy Director of Research at the Institute of Policy Studies, NUS. Well, Dr. Koh, we only found out about the CPIB report today, so why would there be a need for Prime Minister Lee to also ask SMTO to conduct his own independent review?
Hi, good evening. That's indeed the surprise. We hadn't realized that the Prime Minister had asked the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau to look into the matter. SMTO's review was then called a few days later, and his terms of reference were, of course, similar to what CPIB was set to do. But in addition to that, to look at the processes and guidelines and policies of the SLA. So I think that was important to do as well, to shore it up, I think. We want to know how the properties were marketed. Were they rented out at market rate? Were the maintenance of those properties and what was done to prepare them for the tenant standard practice? So these are things that Minister SMTO could deal with. The CPIB, of course, is something quite fearsome. It has the powers to get organizations and people to give information, and they're legally bound to give accurate information. So I think they can manage the investigation professionally, thoroughly, with authority, but with that power to draw on all the information necessary. So what we learned today is that the CPIB had its investigation. SMTO's investigation also drew on the findings of CPIB and added to it one final point, that there is also the code of conduct on ministers and rules of prudence that apply to MPs in the ruling party, PAP, which SMTO had to address and sort of decide, in addition to everything else, how they actually not just adhere to it, not just the letter of it, but the spirit of it.
Dr. Koh, we appear to have clarity on this issue with this CPIB report today, but would you say that there perhaps remain some unanswered questions from it all, from the two reports? I mean, specifically, for example, CPIB did point out that SLA could have been clearer on what it considers guide rent. As you mentioned earlier, that there could have been more clarity on what the guide rent was. What do you think could happen?
Well, I think let's look at, the details of the reports. So indeed, you cited the point about SLA's statement on the 12th of May that the rental on one of the properties was above what is the reserve price for that. But it turns out that actually it was equal to what was the reserve price, because that price had taken into account the amortization of the costs that have been put into clearing some land around that property of 26 Ridout Road. Another one that people want to understand, and I think it's important because it is actually in the report. Now that the border of the property of 26 Ridout had been extended from something to the order of 9,000 square meters to 23,000 square meters, is the rent that the minister is paying, does it cover the whole of that? So there's clarification that the policy of SLA is to charge rental based on the gross floor area of livable space. So that's why the rent has been pegged to the original 9,000 square meters. So I think there's a lot of detail in the reports, especially SMTO's report, that will illuminate some of these issues, and it will make the picture very, very clear. It's very, very thorough.
Now, these reports you mentioned, they will be published and tabled in Parliament in a miscellaneous paper, as Dawn mentioned earlier, and Parliament next sits on Monday.
That's right.
Now, this matter can be and likely will be debated in Parliament. MPs can, in principle, still refute these reports. Can they or can they not?
Yes, of course, and that's the debate that happens. So I think everything's working as it should be. First, you had the CPIB with its investigation, SMTO with processes, and as we know, early in this sort of controversy, the MPs had said that they would pose questions. So now we have a parliament which comprises not only of PAP MPs, but opposition members of parliament and nominated members of parliament. And they are able to, within parliamentary processes, debate this very openly, ask questions about how this was done, ask other questions if they're not clear. And, it is a process that is necessary, and it's something that's rigorous and vigorous, and we look forward to that.
Dr. Koh, you term this as having been something of a controversy, and it was seen in that way by some people. But what are some of the key takeaways or lessons that we can glean from all of this, in particularly about good governance here in Singapore?
Well, I think that we've had to go through this process and establish, as the government has, rigorously, that there'd be no conflict of interest. In fact, the ministers were, in particular, the Minister of Law had been very careful to make sure that he was not in the line of command and decision-making. So first, we have an illustration of how the conflicts of interest by ministers are dealt with, conflicts of interest in public service are dealt with. So that's very important. I think what we would notice in SMTO's report is that while there is the Code of Conduct for Ministers and Rules of Prudence, he said that if there has to be more elaboration of those processes, then it could happen, or that this incident or this whole case of the Ridout bungalows can be used as examples. I think the final one is this. The question remains as to whether there can be one further step, which SMTO hinted might be more rigorous this way, that persons of political interest, politically significant persons or organizations that trade in state assets or state entities may be asked to declare their interests either publicly in the public domain or to another state institution that might hold this information, guard it very carefully, because of course there's privacy interests at hand. We have to balance these out. And only where a question is raised that there is this third party or state institution that can quickly look at this and whether there had been any conflict of interest at play. So that may be one more step, whether it's held by a state institution or declared publicly, because these are politically significant persons or institutions at play.
Dr. Koh, thank you for coming into the studios.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Gillian Koh there from the Institute of Policy Studies at NUS.